Good morning and welcome to the ACT Chess Association stream of the ACT Wednesday Night Rapid Plays, which we're currently running online on chess.com. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and then stream a summary of the tournament and at least one game on the Thursday after they've completed. And last night's Rapid Play online was actually well attended. We've been struggling for numbers recently, but we did get 12 players, started with 10, finished with 12 players taking part, and it was won by Harry Press, scoring a perfect 5 out of 5, and tied for second, I think, on 3.5, if I've got the sums right, candidate Master Hui Li and Malik Amir. I played last night. Normally I don't play, but I played just to make sure we'd get our 5 rounds in, and played horribly. So there are a number of people today who are going fantastic. I at least beat or drew with an FM online, which was me. And I finished on a magnificent 1.5 out of 5. So excuse me if I don't feature one of my games. Instead, I'm going to choose the game between the tournament winner, Harry Press, as black, against Miles Patterson as white. And I featured a couple of games played between these two players. Weirdly enough, this also was played, I think, in the first round of the tournament. Both players are rated above 1800 at Rapid, or even 1900 at Rapid. In real life, that is, not online. And Harry Press is rated about 2200 at Rapid. Miles is rated around about 1900. And there's an interesting, well, I wouldn't say clash of styles, but the games tend to go the same way. And this one's fairly similar, where both players are just looking for a small edge out of the opening. In the end, Harry gets that more than Miles does, and then it's just a question of pressure. Having said that, there were a couple of missed opportunities in both directions for both players, which I am intending to highlight. So let's get to the game. Okay, so knight f3, d5, but d4 is actually the first surprising move by Miles. So Miles is white, Harry is black, because we're essentially going into some Queen's Gambit lines. Miles normally plays the English, so c4 would have been expected here. Knight f6, and now second surprise, London system. Whether this is just some high-level trolling, but interestingly enough, Harry Press has started to play the sort of knight c3, bishop f4 lines. It's a similar London system as well as white, so maybe Miles is just testing out his opening prep as black as a way of finding out what to play when he's facing Harry with colours reversed. So c5, and I like c5, and I'm giving an exclamation mark. And the reason is I think the best way to combat systems like the Collie and the London is to make sure you have more pawns in the centre than your opponent, and that's why c5 gets my tick of approval. c3, knight c6, e3, and we've kind of got what some people are now calling, especially for black, but it does apply for white as well, the triangle setup here, where the d pawn is the strong point, and then you've got basically pawns on e3 and c3, or e6 and c6 if you're black here. And the idea is just to keep the d pawn firmly in place. So a few more moves here. h3 is normal in the London, but I always think it's a bit slow. Bishop g7, bishop to d3, castles. The bishop on d3 is okay, but with the pawn on g6, it's kind of not as effective as if black has played an e6 bishop e7 system. So bringing now knight d7 is the first interesting move here, and the idea is simply to force e4 and e5 in this position, again following that principle of having more pawns in the centre than your opponent. So knight d7, bishop goes back. I mean, and this kind of is a bit of a clue about it's okay there, but if you're going to play h3, generally the idea is the bishop will go back to h2. So if you're just going to put the bishop on g3, do you need to play h3? Okay, e5 gets played. D takes, knight takes, knight takes, knight takes. So a couple of swaps. Nothing to be gained for white by just continuing and swapping, because black has a small but comfortable edge in this position. 2 bishops basically here, plus more space in the centre. And black would have nothing to fear in this position. So the bishop goes back to e2 to retrain, to retain the 2 bishops. Bishop to f5, then knight d2. I think knight d is slightly inaccurate, but it's a question of what else you play, because black can try and force a situation where there's just this monster knight on d3, or white has to give up the 2 bishops in this case here. Because if you play knight d3, rook b1, for example, to defend the b pawn, c4 cements that knight onto this square, at least for now. And after something like knight f3, rook c8, black actually is better, mainly because just the knight sitting on d3. You could either exchange, as I said before. You could play queen b3, but then b6 is fine as well, and this knight's still very strong. Queen e7 was played instead. Bring the knight over. Rook to the centre. Okay, all good. Again, we could start swapping some bits off, but again, just the more space in the centre for black gives black a little bit of an edge here. So, queen to b3, b6, of course, rook a d1, and bishop to e4. The other try here is something like c4, forcing the queen up, and then again knight d3. But in this position, and to be honest, in the last couple of positions we looked at, as I said, forcing the swap and keeping the 2 bishops. But after rook fe1, black's still got to come up with a winning plan here. Probably, and it might take a little bit of time, look at just pushing on the queen side, making sure the b6 pawn is protected, a6, b5, a5, b4 type setups, because the bishop on g7 is still quite strong, operating down this diagonal. So if you can disturb this pawn set up here of b2, c3, this bishop can join into the game much more effectively. Instead, bishop e4 was played, and the idea is just to try and capture a couple of times on f3. And queen a4, and exactly right, takes, and takes. And black is now going for a plan involving damaged pawn structure. And normally this is fine. I mean, in terms of balancing or working out what is good for one side and good for the other, I'm not going to argue that having double pawns is better than not having double pawns. But to be honest, sometimes it is difficult to exploit. And I found that out last night. I was playing in the tournament, as I said, and I had a situation where I doubled my opponent's pawns, but I struggled to actually take advantage of that. And in the end, the game finished in a draw. Queen e6, king goes up to protect the h pawn, which was the other target here. Black plays a6 with a plan of b5. The other idea is just to leave the pawn on a7 and just double the rooks down the d file. So rook d2, b5 now, hitting the queen back to c2, and now rook d7, rook. So now we've got this issue of all the rooks are piled up on the d file, doubled on both sides. White is covering d4 quite effectively with the 2 pawns on e3 and c3. Black at some point would love to play d4, and a lot of the battle eventually revolves around this square and what's going to happen. But for now, white plays rook d3 just to bide their time. Queen f5. I mean, ideally, if the rook goes back, we can swap and then play something like d4. Queen across to e2. And queen e6. I was having a look at whether h5 was effective immediately in this position. It does get played later on. And then a move like a4 to try and fight back on the queen side. And at first I thought, oh yeah, g5 looks okay, but in fact this just blunders a pawn after... it doesn't quite blunder, well, it does. After e4, one line that I haven't shown yet, but I'll just quickly look at, is this line here, and then when the queen retreats, the h pawn goes, and while black can now take, what am I missing here? Yeah, not taking there first, swapping rooks first and then taking, I should say, just making sure I'm not dropping too much material in this position here. Yeah, and then takes the pawn. That's the line I'm looking at here. Yeah, I mean, that blunders a pawn, and if you just retreat straight away, queen d2 is pretty solid for white as well because of the pin down the d file here. So queen f6, for example, just retreating the queen so that e5 doesn't hit the queen. Queen c2, and the position's pretty okay. So what black played was better with queen e6, so that e5 doesn't cause some issues at this point. A3 was played. Now H5 kind of works. Certainly H4 to stop G5, but that does create a bit of a weakness now. The H pawn is going to be a target for the bishop and the queen, and this kind of ties black up. Now, white up, sorry. Now, strangely, there was a bit of a blunder, exchange of blunders here, as Dale Johansen is apt to make. White played b4. I mean, it kind of makes sense after the a3 idea, but it just turns out to be a mistake, which black failed to punish. c4 was just winning here. Because the rook goes back to here, and you've just dropped the c pawn. Okay, and clearly black is better with the extra pawn and the fact that it's c4 going down the board. And your other option is play something like rook d4, but you're just surrendering the exchange and you're not getting enough compensation for it. So blunder with b4, black misses it and plays c takes b4, and after c takes b4, white's position actually not bad, because this d pawn, and we were talking about fighting over the d pawn before, without the opportunity of being supported by the c pawn, it's now isolated, and it's actually a lot harder to defend. So white has actually now got some good chances here. Queen back to e7, rook h1 to protect the h pawn, because the queen and the bishop had lined up on it, and d4. And this is not a bad move, because essentially you're trying to eliminate your weakness with the d pawn. Obviously white can't take it because the queen drops at the end, so d4 gets played, e4 sorry gets played, bishop e4 to start swapping a few things off, but f4 is a nice move, and this position actually is quite equal now. White's still got those doubled f pawns, but black has still got to worry about the isolated d pawn, even when it's now passed, because after the bishop moves back here, because black is going to swap that bishop to a different diagonal, f3 to support the pawn. White could have played rook hc1, of course, and after king f8, rook here, and this position's equal. The queen in f3 is going to happen anyway, and the queen's going to probably sneak back to d1 to back up the rooks. So f3 was played, queen to e6, now queen to d2, bishop to a7 to protect the pawn after rook d1, so a bit of preventative chess here. And it frees up the rook going to c8 instead. And bishop to f2. The other idea, and the move that I wouldn't have mind seeing played at some point, was f5. It does get played later, but right now is very interesting. G takes, and the reason for f5 is that it now allows the queen to come into g5 and attack the king. And even if you block here, which seems to make sense, e takes f5 is the right move because of the pin the queen can't take. Wouldn't want to anyway because it'd be hanging. So we swap queens first, and then rook d5, f4, sure, give away that pawn there. But after king f3 and the bishop going back to f2 and the king going to e4, black is going to find it very difficult to hang on to that pawn, and the position's going to probably peter out to equality. Only thing you got to watch for is possibly the h pawn, but that should be fine. Okay, so bishop f2 is not bad though. Rook c4 to defend sideways. Again, f5 could have been tried here. King h2. King h2, weirdly enough, makes sense in terms of just getting the king out of danger, but it turns out it doesn't, and there's a little bit of a problem with king h2, which is going to become apparent very, very shortly. Bishop to b6. And both sides are kind of just rearranging their bits for now. The other reason for king h2, I suspect, was to open the g-file for the rooks if necessary. f5, as I said, is eventually coming, but bishop check now is a good move. White has opened the diagonal, and so black is actually taking advantage of that. And that's why the king probably could have gone to h1 straight away rather than h2. I'm not saying that that's the reason why the game ended in a win for black, but it's those sort of minor inaccuracies which then cause some other problems. Because of now black gets another tempo with queen e5, and we're just simply threatening mate on h2. That's all. Just a small threat. One that's easily dealt with bishop g1 for now. Then the queen drops in to g3, and suddenly pawn on h4 is under attack, pawn on f3 is under attack. Now, in the end, white defended this quite well. When I was originally analysing this position, I thought queen f2 was the right move. But the problem with queen f2 I discovered later, was queen h3 check. Okay, and you play bishop h2. And then it turns out a move bishop f4 just absolutely paralyzes black. And we're going to see, paralyzes white, I should say. I'm going to see in a second why. The main problem is, after taking and taking, throw this in, the queen on f2 is now tied to defending too many things. It's defending the h2 bishop. It's defending the f3, not quite f3 pawn, but defending the h4 pawn. And if you play a move like queen e2 just to bide your time, you're both dropping the h pawn, but also the other threat is simply to play the d rook to c7, and then you're just threatening rook c2 as well. And the bishop on f4 is covering the d2 square, and white's position just disintegrates under this threat. So queen h2 was the right move. It was a very good find. By the way, one of the reasons why I probably played quite badly last night was I'm a little bit out of practice because I've been organising rather than playing. And in this position, every time I look at it, I keep saying, why can't black play queen takes f3? Completely missing that the rook on d3 is guarding it. That's the explanation for why I'm playing terrible chess at the moment, because I'm suffering from chess blindness. Queen h2, so we go for swaps, swaps and swaps. Okay, king takes h2, g takes f5, rook g1's not a bad idea, king f8. And I don't know whether this was a finger slip or whether this was a deliberate plan, but white played e5 here, and it's not a great move. Taking on f5 makes more sense, and then after rook d5, rook dg1 piling back up on the pawn, and if you play rook takes f5, king g3 is followed by rook d5, gives black certainly the edge because they're a pawn up, but with both rooks comfortable on the d file, it's for white, it's holdable, this position. And rook and pawn endings are very difficult to win a pawn up, very difficult to defend a pawn down is the old joke, and double rook endings doubly so, I think. Coming back just to here where we've taken the pawn in this line, if white tries to simplify with rook here, it's still not that bad because you just swap rooks, you take here, rook check. Oh no, it is that bad, sorry. King g7, rook d5. The problem is the a pawn is going, and even though the h pawn is going here, the fact that the black king is on the king side means that that h pawn is harder to make a queen than what happens on the queen side where the king is much further away for white. Rook a4, for example, and we go rook g5, king up, king h there, and we just take it. And it's currently 3 pawns against 1, and black should have no difficulty converting this ending, even if they were probably down to their last sort of minute of thinking time. Instead, e5 though, not so great. Obviously the follow-up is to try and play f4 at some point, but it just doesn't work. Rook c3, good move here. You don't want to take and take because the c pawn is going to be very difficult to stop. So rook dg1, rook takes, and then king e7. And the winning plan that black chooses is quite effective. On the other hand, I actually thought f4 might have been the right move here because it cuts the white king out from getting in on the king side, and that king now has to go quite a long way around the board, and in the meantime the black king can just go e7, e6, takes on e5 in most lines. But king e7 was fine, king g3, king e6, f4 now to protect, okay, but the black king has a second way into the position either via e4 or c4. So the king goes to f3 to stop, and then rook c7 actually was quite a nice move in this ending. King e2, and now king e4 is open for business. Rook c3 would have worked as well, but rook goes back to d2. And if black wanted to find the brilliant, hey, maybe this guy's using a computer win, not that he was, rook c2 might have been the move here. Obviously, because after rook takes here, check, wins back the rook, takes, and you just take on f4. And then you're going to take on e5, and you're just going to win this ending pretty simply. Instead, rook c3 was good, and again, white's now just getting pushed back. Rook goes back. Certainly, rook takes a3 could have been played here. d3 was played instead, forcing the king to go somewhere. King f2, rook c2, king back to e1. If you just go here, then d2 followed by king d3 is going to be a nice winning idea. King went back to e1 and then king e3, and white resigned here. For example, king f1, we just play rook f2, king g1, d2, rook back to b1, rook takes f4, and king is coming up, and we're just going to make a queen at some point with the d pawn here. So it was a solid win for black. Black kind of just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. There were two major mistakes in the game. b4 here, which was then missed, and e5 here. Whether that was a finger slip, I'm not sure. But black was better for a lot of the game. And without sort of steering anyone in one way or the other in terms of opening theory, the fact that I think black was keeping more pawns in the centre was a good effective strategy that did pay off even going into the middle game here with this arrangement of pawns on d5 and c5 as well. So that was last night's ACT Chess Association Wednesday night rapid play, open to all members of the ACT Chess Association and anyone who basically is happy to identify who they are, and I generally check to see who they really are on the ACF rating list, is welcome to play. It's mainly Canberra players though, and they seem to enjoy it. The numbers have been a lot less in the last month because people are now just playing over-the-board chess with the Canberra Club and the Tuggeranong Club opening. And the other piece of news to keep you watching at least for the next month is Movember is starting. And so starting in a couple of days, I'm going to be growing my usual November moustache. So next week you'll see a small moustache, and then the week after you'll see a bigger moustache, and by the end you'll see an absolutely massive moustache covering my face. And if that's not a reason to tune in every week from now on, I'm not sure what is. So my name's Sean Press. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next Thursday for the next summary of the ACT Rapid Play.